We're back again. I'm Alex from Lower Street, and on this episode of Podcast Book Club, we're talking about history podcasts, a personal favourite genre of podcast for me. We're joined for this conversation by Ian Sanders, who runs the amazing Cold War Conversations podcast. We talk about running an independent podcast, finding the right guests, and we talk about what it takes to survive on the world's best, worst website. Twitter. Or X. You know the one I mean. Anyway, we also talk about The Rest is History, which is an extremely popular show here in the UK, and it's very interesting to get everyone's thoughts on it. Let's get going. Today, I'm joined, first of all, by Ian. How's it going, Ian?
Great. Delighted to come on the show.
Ian is host of the Cold War Conversations podcast, which is, was it 352 episodes or something like that now?
316.
Wow. Yeah. My editing brain winces at the thought of that much content.
Well, I did want to choose a subject where there was no shortage of opportunities, and certainly the Cold War fits that bill.
Absolutely. I'm also joined by Marion.
Hello. I'm Marion. I'm a producer at Lower Street. And not a historian, but keen, deeply keen.
Absolutely. And Sam.
Hello, I'm Sam. I'm an executive producer at Lower Street and a recovering history podcaster. I had a history podcast of my own before I started at Lower Street. So excited to be here today and talk about someone else's.
So to start us off, Ian, could you just tell us a bit about yourself and the show?
Yeah. So my name's Ian Sanders. I'm the host and producer of the Cold War Conversations podcast. The podcast started in 2018. Really started out as a project to capture the oral histories of the Cold War. The genesis was really my father, who was a Normandy veteran. So he was in World War II, and I recorded an interview with him before he died. And in 2018, I was looking for a creative avenue. I've always enjoyed audio, talk radio, and I sort of discovered podcasts by accident and got in contact with a host of a podcast I was really keen on called Spybury, which was about spy fiction books. Turned out he was also very interested in the Cold War. Urged me to bring out a podcast about East Germany. And I thought, no, I fancy doing something broader than that. And Cold War Conversations came from there. Thought I would get a couple of hundred listeners and the odd nice comment on Twitter. And almost 6 years later, we're now at 1.3 million downloads a year and more than one comment on Twitter.
Yes, I actually do want to go onto Twitter in a little bit. That's amazing. And what was it that drew you to the Cold War specifically?
The Cold War occurred during my formative years. I was born in the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis, not that I remember much about it. And the sort of threat of nuclear war and that the Soviet Union and the sort of certainty of things then were a big part of my life. I mean, during that period, you thought the Soviet Union was never going to go away. And yet, within a couple of years, it completely disappeared. And similarly with the Berlin Wall opening, never thought that was going to happen in my lifetime. But going back to my father's experiences, I thought there's really no podcast out there that's capturing what it was like to be there during the Cold War, those personal experiences. So that's really what started Cold War Conversations. And I had a couple of lucky breaks early on. And really, it was just purely through asking people on social media. So I interviewed Gary Powers, who was the son of the U-2 pilot who was shot down over the Soviet Union. So anybody who's seen the Tom Hanks film Bridge of Spies will be familiar with that incident. Really interesting interview with him about his father's experiences. And at the end of the conversation, he said, would you like to interview the son of Nikita Khrushchev, the former Soviet leader? And you can imagine I didn't ponder that too long and said yes, and then had the opportunity to interview him. And he was particularly interesting because he was in his 20s when the Cuban Missile Crisis started. So he was right at the side of his father. And indeed, his father had shared some of the challenges that he was facing there. So it was a fascinating conversation. And then that sort of made quite a good calling card for approaching, other guests. But for me, it's the unknown stories is what really appeals to me. It's to give voice to those people whose story would never be told. And that's what, is my favorite part of the podcast. Yes, I have the odd big name on there, but there's a huge number of stories out there that have never been told. And there's plenty more for me to find as well.
Absolutely. And I feel like it's almost a side of history that's missing from a lot of history podcasts. They tend to be quite broad brush looks at the past. I mean, the episode we'll talk about later, I think, is a fairly good example of that. And there's not a huge amount about what people's day-to-day lives are. Were you thinking about consciously about there being a gap in the market, so to speak, for that kind of podcast?
I wasn't really thinking about there being a gap in the market. I just wanted to produce something that I would want to listen to. And I think that's what a lot of podcasters sort of start out doing. But the more I got into it, the more I realized that there were some incredible stories out there. And, I've sort of lost count of the number of interviews I've done where, the interviewee has said, I've never told anybody about this before, or I've never told my family about this. I remember interviewing a veteran of the Hungarian uprising of 1956, and his daughter was on the call with us, and it was a fun interview because they were both talking on the interview, and I could hear the red wine being poured in the background. But she said, he's never told me this stuff. He's never shared the detail. And I think sometimes bringing in somebody who's neutral, who isn't part of a family relationship, can bring out details that wouldn't be brought out. That being said, for me, it's letting them talk. It's letting them go off at tangents and not interrupting. It's not about me. It's about the guest. So I tend to joke when people ask, well, what do I do? How do I do it? I say, well, I just press the record button.
And speaking of editing, you mentioned earlier, there's this weekly cadence of episodes, over 300 of them. You're an independent podcaster, I think is an accurate label. And we work in, branded content, and there's often a fair amount of resources and time dedicated to stuff that we do over and above what an independent podcaster could do. How's it been for you, putting out all these episodes, doing, I assume, the vast majority of the work yourself?
It gets challenging at times, but the more you do it, the quicker you get at doing it. What I tend to do is I'm trying to record episodes quite a way ahead of time. So I've got a bank of at least 4 sitting there and ready to go, just in case there are situations which I can't avoid that mean that otherwise there'd be a delay there. I have a set template that I use that almost means that I just have to drop the interview piece in to the editor that I use. I mean, I use Audacity still because I'm familiar with that. I have tried some other editors and just not got on with them. But it's the one that I'm familiar with. And, but the editing does take quite a lot of time. And I think that is one of the areas that the listener isn't aware of, is that the recording is only one part of the job of the podcaster. You've got to do the editing. You've also got to do the marketing of it as well. So, you're putting together audiograms and tweets and show notes and all sorts of other stuff there. So I think I've got it to a reasonably good art and not too many late nights to worry about.
Circling back to something you mentioned earlier, Twitter, I think that's an area you're quite strong in. It seems as though you have a fairly substantial and active following on Twitter. I'm curious, what's your approach there?
Well, I started the Twitter account before I started the podcast because I was sort of procrastinating about doing the podcast. But I started the Twitter account probably about 4 months before. And part of that was to actually test the waters and to see whether I could build a following on Twitter who I stupidly assume would automatically want to listen to the podcast as well. But, that's not necessarily the case. And also with Twitter, I found it really useful in terms of finding guests. Just by, looking at tweets. I mean, a good example, if I go back to that Hungarian freedom fighter from 1956, that came about through seeing a tweet that his daughter had put up, and it was a video of her father. And the comment on the tweet was, my father's going for his last beer before lockdown. And in 1956, he was 19-year-old off to pick up a machine gun or something like that. And I thought, hang on, there's something here, and contacted them. And obviously it turned out he was, and it was knowing a bit about the history and those key years and thinking, hang on, there's detective work in there. But as far as building a community on Twitter, for me, I would say the keys are engage with your audience. So if somebody comments or offers your podcast up to somebody else and you're tagged in it, thank them for that and engage with them. The other thing that I found that increased my following was just retweet stuff. So follow people who are in the same subject area and retweet their anything that's relevant there, and you will build your sort of profile up as a subject specialist or an account worth following if somebody's interested in that period of history. And the third thing I would say is just be nice to people, just be pleasant with people, which is getting more and more difficult to find on Twitter. And I find it frustrating because it is my main engagement channel. I think I've got about 19,000, almost 20,000 followers on there. But I have seen a big drop off of people leaving there. So it then means you're having to go on Mastodon and Blue Sky, and you're having to use all these other different channels. But those would be my key learnings from building a following on Twitter.
Yeah, you just mentioned something that was already something I kind of, grade accounts on whether or not I'm going to follow them, is the stuff they retweet, repost, whatever it is. It's almost as though you can be a bit lazy and say, you can curate stuff for me, almost. I think that's for me been one of the main advantages of following you on Twitter, is all the other interesting stuff that I wouldn't even know how to go out and find myself, but just see it through your likes and retweets and all that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I guess the other thing I would say is also inject some humor in there as well. Be a little bit playful on social media. I mean, there's bits of the Cold War which are really dark, but there's other bits that are light. So if I can find something funny on there, I will, because that's part of me and that's part of the way that I interview the guests. So if I have the opportunity to be a little bit funny, sometimes I might even take the mickey out of them slightly. If you get that comfort there, it just brings, I guess, a little bit of my personality and just a bit of light against some darkness or shade in there. And from the feedback I get from the listeners, people generally like that, and the people who don't like it probably don't tell me. They just leave.
I'd love to know, actually, it might be a no. Do you get much pushback on any of your guests. Have you ever, because obviously the Cold War is a contentious period, there was a lot of fighting, a lot of disagreement, political and otherwise. Have you ever had anyone push back and say that a certain guest was inappropriate or anything in that vein?
I haven't had any. Well, yeah, you get the odd bit of criticism on social media. So I did one episode, can't remember what it was called. It was something like my dad was the leader of the Canadian Communist Party or something like that. And he also had quite strong left-wing views on there. And I think I got a few criticisms there. But my answer to that is that I am looking to get the broadest possible experience of the Cold War. And one of the things that I'm particularly proud of is that I've covered quite a number of women's stories of the Cold War, which generally you don't tend to get that detail. And I think about 20% of the episodes that I now have out there are women's stories or female historians and those are fascinating stories because I don't know, you tend to not get those in a history book, and I think that's a real, it's a real shame, and that's what, again, me trying to find these unheard voices that can be shared as these pieces of history.
I'm curious, Ian. I know you said you sort of got it down to a fine art, but like, how long does it take you to produce one episode? Let's say from sort of research to final publishing.
I would say it's probably about 5 or 6 hours a week, something like that. If you put in the research, the backwards and forwards with the guest, often you may need a preparatory chat with them so they get to know you, and I can just say, look, this is how it works. I'm going to be editing the audio. One thing I do say to my guests is, look, my ultimate aim is to make you sound as good as possible. So I'm going to try and edit out, if you stumble across a line, just say, I'll have another go at that and I will edit out the stumble. And then I say to them, and most of the stumbles I'm editing out are mine. But that's what I would estimate. And as I said before, there's also the marketing on it. I think I spend far too much time on social, but it's
time well spent.
Getting the word out there. I mean, my audience is an interesting audience, if you don't mind me just talking a little bit about that. Is geographically, it's a third UK and a third US. And Australia's the next largest at 6%. So there's a good split. And I feel that the US number should be higher. And it's an area that I'm, trying to work on there to try and expand that audience. But Canada has a very poor showing, Marion, and I'm relying on you to spread the word.
I'm on it. So sorry. That's surprising, actually, because we love our Cold War history, and we, there's I don't know. I mean, I guess like Canada has this like unusual sort of experience of it, I guess, just being right next door to the US and but also having this like strong connection to the UK and like, yeah, I mean, I grew up, like my formative years were in the Cold War, and as a young person, remember the Berlin Wall coming down and all of that kind of stuff. So it's totally fascinating to me as like a super unique time and with unique anxieties. So yeah, I'll spread the word.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. I'm also curious about like some of your guests. Like, you're obviously, you've probably heard a lot of similar stories, over 300 plus episodes, but has there been anything totally surprising to you that you had never heard before?
Probably quite regularly. I mean, probably one of my favorite episodes And it was with an author who'd written a book about her experiences, but it was an author called Carmen Bugan, and she was 12 years old in Romania, and she comes home from school to find the Romanian secret police pulling apart her house. And it turns out her father's gone on a one-man protest to Bucharest against Ceausescu, who was the communist leader at that time, and he's been arrested. And she goes on to describe the surveillance the family were under subsequently. So they were forced to live in just 3 rooms of their house. The place was bugged. They didn't know whether their villagers were informing on them. At one point, their dogs were poisoned, which they believe by the security forces. And it's a horrendous story, but they do manage to emigrate to the US. And I found one of the most powerful parts of the interview. And I think this is one of the things that I'd not expected about podcasting, is how moving some of the interviews could be, because she describes explaining to her grandfather who had dementia and trying to explain to him that they were going to the United States and that they would never see him again. And it was just, I needed a break after that. But it's things like that you don't. I certainly didn't expect when I went into this that that I was going to get stories like that. But I'm delighted that I was able to share it. But it's one of those episodes that just doesn't get the listenership that I think it should do. Whereas if I put something out about spies, then that's guaranteed to get a good download number.
Yeah, that's very unique. I said earlier, I don't have, I'm not a historian, but one of my first producing jobs was recording oral histories for a social history project. And it was my first introduction to social history and really like that power of the oral history and what happens to just regular people. And I love that about your show, that it's, people you don't necessarily hear about the news, but had these incredible firsthand experiences with a very unique period of time. So that's a great example of that.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes I'll put out an episode and then I'll get an avalanche of people with similar experiences contact me, which is great. I did an episode with somebody who served in the East German Army, and I'm always interested in the view from almost the other side of the hill. What was it like to be in the Warsaw Pact military? And then within a day, I had a guy who had been in signals intelligence and was listening in on NATO communications with the East German Army. I got a East German tank commander contact me to describe his story. And some of the experiences are similar. Certainly the early years, their schooling, and you'd expect in communist countries that the schooling is going to be pretty standard there, but there's still context and nuance even in those experiences in terms of who their school friends are and party members and teachers and those details. And as with any podcaster, you struggle with the edit because you think, I want to keep that in, I want to keep that in, I want to keep that in. So my editing is perhaps not as concise as it could be, but I just want to keep the essence in there. So for some guests, they may have 3 episodes because I think the story is worth telling. And certainly one of those was Ralph, who was from East Germany. He was a Kung Fu teacher in East Germany, naturally attracted the interest of the Stasi because I think he was the only one there and he was receiving stuff from the West, gets arrested by the Stasi, interrogated for 6 months, gets held in a prison. And it's a fascinating story there. But he was such a great raconteur. And sometimes you get those guests that are like, you do just have to press record.
We've reached the end of my list now. Before we talk about the rest is history, And I think this is quite a good jumping off point as well, because we're moving to, in some ways, kind of the polar opposite of the human kind of lived experience of individuals in the Cold War to an episode that is sprawling, I think is a good word to use, from Putin to the Politburo to the way the Soviet economy functioned to seemingly a decision halfway through to expand the scope of the episode even further than it had already was in the first half. So first thing I'd like to do is just go around and get everyone's quick general impressions of the episode. What do you think of it? Starting with Sam.
I have to be honest, it's not my favourite episode of The Rest is History. I do really like The Rest is History generally. I think they set their sights a little bit too wide on this one and took a somewhat scattergun approach to, I mean, obviously they split it across 4 installments, but they took a fairly scattergun approach to what is an incredibly nuanced and complicated and detailed part of history. And it was a bit of a miss for me. I learnt a lot, but I felt like there were huge gaps afterwards. And I'd also love to have, there was a lot more thought and opinion than I tend to get, and a lot less actual citing of history, which, they got a lot to get through. But it was fine. It was entertaining, but it wasn't their best work.
What about yourself, Marion?
Yeah, I learned a lot too. I sort of, I had to re-listen because I kind of, dropped in and out a little bit, but just in terms of attention, I was in the middle of something. But I felt like I wanted to hear more clips. I loved how they kicked off that first episode with Bush. And it was a really nice way in, just getting this historical, archival clip of his perspective on Putin's visit and the soul of Russia, and that idea of this place that no one could understand, and trying to understand it through this person. And I liked that also as a setup for the whole episode, which was, what did he say? You look at history at the time of a person when they're 20, then you can understand their whole sort of trajectory. Or their approach or their philosophy. And I thought that was a really interesting way to look at Putin, because, I sort of, a lot of times just go, okay, well, he's insane. And I think the idea is let's try and get to who is this person and where do they come from? And so for me, that was really interesting. But yeah, I could have used a little more sort of, I don't know, just pulling me back into sort of world context and news events rather than back and forth discussion.
Yeah, I think they certainly have a winning format / dynamic, but it has to be firing on all cylinders, I think. Otherwise you get episodes like this, which I still enjoyed listening to. I've listened to 2 or 3 times at this point now, but I get what you mean. Ian, what did you think?
Yeah, I thought it was okay. I'm immersed in this every week, so I found it quite easy to follow. But listening to it a second time, I was thinking, if you don't necessarily know your way around some of this stuff, this seems quite disjointed and not easy to follow there. So it wasn't great from that point of view. You're right. They bounce off each other really well. It's almost good cop, bad cop. Sort of dynamic they've got going on, but they didn't really go much into Putin and his persona, I thought. they weren't sort of clear about the fact that he was his KGB HQ in Dresden, where he was posted at the time of the Berlin Wall opening, was 100 yards from the Stasi HQ. So he saw the Stasi HQ being ransacked from outside the the gates of where he was. So he's seen what happens when a state turns on its leaders. And perhaps that's too blunt describing that, but I didn't get that connection within that episode with that understanding. They talked about the fear in Russia of being surrounded and, that they're different, they're always outside and things like that. So they sort of alluded to some of this stuff, and maybe they were teeing this up for the next episode. So I haven't listened to the next episode there, but I just didn't feel it ran particularly smoothly. If you're a listener that's not familiar with this period in history,
I agree with what you guys have said. I think it's such an interesting, almost counterpoint to your own show, Ian, because when they're talking about who he is, I had like a very strong feeling of somebody who doesn't really know a huge amount about the Cold War. It's like, okay, what clothes was he wearing? What car was he driving? Was there, like, I don't know, all that above ground plumbing that you see in East Berlin? Like, what was it? The material conditions of him when he grew up and the places that he went. I feel like it would have benefited from being a bit more specific than that. But one thing this episode does have going for it is they managed to cover a lot. And it's interesting talking about, you mentioned the Stasi HQ being sacked and sort of Putin's internal thought process, Ian. I was kind of surprised at the stuff that they did touch on about Putin and his thought process. Felt very speculative when they're talking about when he was a younger man. Did he have that like fire in him for the socialist or the communist project? I was just thinking when I was listening to them discuss it, it's like, this is pure speculation. It felt very odd to me then being like, yeah, maybe he kind of did. No, I did. Yeah, maybe he didn't.
And I think it was similar because they also talked about the Soviet leadership, that perhaps some of them were not still in that revolutionary fervor, that they were just in it for the money, I guess. There was that inference. And perhaps that could have been, that could have been the case, that once you get embedded in a regime like that, you've got a lot to lose. So therefore, you do follow the party line and you do parrot lines that you don't believe in, because that just keeps the status quo. And certainly they were describing the period of Brezhnev being in power, which was described as they didn't describe it as this specifically, but historically it was viewed as a time of stagnation in the Soviet Union. That just things weren't changing. I mean, they described that the standard of living was reasonably good. People could get a fridge and stuff like that. But in the background, the economy is struggling. And they did talk about that. They talked about the oil prices. I mean, you're right. They did cover, considering it was a half-hour episode, there was a huge amount they covered in there. But I think you're correct. There was a lot of speculation on there. And it's difficult in a podcast to reference books or reference things like that, because it would just break up the narrative. So perhaps some of that stuff that they were being speculative about is actually correct, but who knows?
It's just a shame sometimes, isn't it, when all it would take is for them to say biographers at the time reckoned. And you don't even really need to go into much more detail than that, but you're right, without anything along those lines, it sounds quite speculative. And what I did like as well is the fact that at the beginning of the podcast, they set out the stall of the kind of the Western idea of Russian soul, and then proceeded through the rest of the episode to absolutely fall into their own trap, which I love. That's kind of not a criticism, because I really enjoy, I'm a Westerner with a Western impression of Russia and the Soviet bloc, and I very much enjoyed that. But
yeah, I mean, the volume of content they produce, I don't know how they obviously they've got an army of researchers that I don't have, but they jump around so many different so, they're not subject specialists. They are subject specialists in some areas, and you can tell that from some episodes that they really know their stuff. But sometimes they sort of veer off, or it sounds like they veer off into areas which they're less certain about. But it's a popular show. People enjoy it. I mean, I enjoy it. I'm not, I still listen to it. But not the greatest, this one.
I think one of the things that they do, which this is a slight assumption on my part, but I think really increases their work rate, is part of their dynamic tends to be that one of them knows more than the other on a given subject. And I wonder if they're almost able to like double up maybe on the amount of research they're doing. One has a kind of general idea about the things that they're discussing, and then the other one knows more specifics. And I think as well as that point, it'd be interesting to hear your guys' thoughts on like their dynamic, how this co-hosting thing works, because it's worked very well for this show, and it's also a format that I think, I don't have any data to back it, but in my subjective experience is becoming more and more prevalent in podcasting, which is rather than a straight up interview or a monologue show, it's two people talking to each other. And that's the foundation for the show. I know that's not a very clear question, but...
No, I thought it, I mean, what it does is allows somebody to be an expert and somebody to be not. And then, I mean, I think a couple points, one of them corrected the other and said, no, actually that's not right. And I think, I mean, or, that's a common misunderstanding. And I think that works well. It's a nice discussion. I don't want to hear people just agreeing with one another the whole time, or two people who know what the other is going to say as they go along. So it as someone listening in on a conversation, it makes it more interesting to listen to.
I mean, with the way that they produce this, I mean, they must have some notes there in front of them. They can't just be doing this off the cuff. So there could be an element of scripting. They are prompted to ask certain questions, which the other one has the answers to, and the other one answers it in a way as though it sounds like they are pulling it out of their head. Who knows? I wouldn't want to cast those sort of aspersions, but I'd love to know how it's produced, what the production process is here, because I could see you being able to reproduce something like this in that way, as long as you've got somebody who can sort of ad lib from a script to make it sound as though it's an ad lib rather than you're reading from it. If you see what I mean, I'm probably not explaining that very well.
I completely agree. I mean, speaking from personal experience, when I promise this is the only time I mention my former history podcast back in the day, my co-host and one of us would lead on each episode, and it was a weekly podcast, and that gave each of us 2 weeks to research an episode. We'd send the other some spark notes on the research that we'd found, which would contain questions to ask, suggested lines of conversation, and we would run off bullet points. And it works very well, because as long as you've been together long enough as a presenting duo that you can bounce off each other and you know kind of what the other is thinking, then actually you can, as Alex was saying, you can double up your throughput. And you can do a lot more research for one episode than you might be able to do if, for example, for yourself, Ian, as a solo podcaster, having to do the whole lot yourself. That is a lot in a week. I'm sure you wouldn't object to having 2 weeks to research.
No. And I've often thought about changing the cadence.
Great. So I have one more point. It's something that I mentioned in quite a few sessions for Podcast Book Club, but it is the ad break in the middle where we go to some... It's host read. I don't know if it's programmatic or not. I think that's how I don't know if it's dynamically inserted or not. I know they do that for some of their newer episodes. But for me, the interesting thing about the central ad break was that they went to the host read ads, came back, and then proceeded to do more self-promo. And that was, I think, in an episode that felt maybe a bit more kind of coherent, that would have been okay. But I was still kind of reeling from the first half. And then in the second half, they're talking about can't remember what it was, some kind of tour members club or something, and then it's back off to the races.
Yeah, it was their subscription service, I think they were talking about. I must admit, I hit the skip button when I got partway through the first bit of the promo, and then found I had to hit the skip button quite a few times to then get through the rest of it.
It's tricky as well because with the host read ads, their voices sound different, so it's easy to tell when you're skipping through quickly when you've got back to the main content. But for their subscription service stuff, that was a bit more fiddly. But yeah, I was the same. About a minute of it, and then
it's tricky. I have ads in Cold War Conversations. I've only had them in since April this year, and have not wanted to do it for a while, but and needed to do it just to keep the podcast going. But what I have done is just kept them as one. Apart from the pre-roll, it's just one 30-second ad in there, and it's generally between after somebody's answered a question before I'm asking the next one. So I try and minimize the interruption there. But if you sign up as a financial supporter, you get it ad free.
I think there is almost like an unspoken etiquette as well around ads, which is I think people online in general are much more accepting now of the fact that everything can't be free. Stuff needs to be paid for, and the people who make content you enjoy should be paid to make it. But it's when it's that scheduled bit of when the advert should be, and then there's a little bit more after that it almost feels as though like an unspoken promise has been broken in a way. It's like, hey, you're supposed to, you've made your money, aren't we supposed to get back to the content now? That was my final thought. Does anybody have anything else they want to add?
Only to say on the dynamically insert, I'm assuming they're dynamically inserted adverts. They were certainly recorded at a different point. I hated how different it sounded. And I don't even really know why, but there was something just incredibly jarring about it for me. But maybe they do it deliberately. Maybe it's deliberately annoying so that you subscribe and get them significantly more money than the ads would generate. Who am I to say? But Wikipedia tells me that they make £70,000 a month off the podcast. So something's working for them in that model.
Good for them.
Yeah, I won't be going there. Not for that. I mean, the host read ads, I think, are challenging because you're having to summon up enthusiasm for a product, which automatically sounds a bit fake. It's always a difficult one to carry off, I think, and it has to really fit your audience as well.
Excellent. And where should the people go, Ian, if they want to know more about Cold War Conversations?
Okay, so if you want to hear more of Cold War Conversations, it's coldwarconversations.com. We're also on Twitter at Cold War Pod, and we're on Facebook, Instagram, Mastodon, Blue Sky. Bebo. Well, we're most places. If you search for Cold War Conversations, you will find us.
Excellent. Ian, thank you very much. Marion, thank you. Sam, thank you. And Alex, thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure and a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Tons of fun.